Nós, estudantes de Relações Internacionais da PUC São Paulo e integrantes do Grupo de Estudo de Conflitos Internacionais, firmamos uma parceria com Democracy Now!
A partir de agora, vincularemos com legendas em português as mais importantes notícias internacionais da semana.
From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
These are your victories, Solomon. You and Mohammed Solomon. These are your great achievements. Slaughtering children and women. These are your traits, you criminal.
Yemenis condemn the rulers of Saudi Arabia after a Saudi-led airstrike hits a wedding party in northern Yemen, killing 20 people. We'll get the latest. Plus, we go to Memphis, where a prominent Latino journalist, Manuel Duran Ortega, faces deportation after he was arrested while reporting 3 weeks ago at a protest against immigration policies.
Buenas tardes, amigos de Memphis Noticias. En estos momentos iniciamos la participación con todos ustedes.
This protest is going to be held in front of 201 Poplar, and let me tell you what is the purpose of this demonstration. As you can see, everything is getting ready here.
And we look at the future of Cuba as a new leader succeeds Raul Castro. Plus, we look at how an ABC journalist's secret liaison with Fidel Castro changed the course of the Cold War. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Yemen, a U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition airstrike tore through a wedding party late Sunday, killing at least 20 people. Most of the dead were reportedly women and children who were gathered in one of the wedding party tents. The bride was also among those killed. Medics and residents said more than 30 others were injured in the attack in the Bani Qais district in northern Yemen. At the scene of the bombing, one man lashed out at Saudi Arabia.
They always target weddings. They kill children and innocent people. But we can only complain to God, not to any human rights or any country in the world.
More than 15,000 people have been killed since the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition intervened in Yemen in March 2015, backed with U.S. intelligence, weapons, and munitions. Saudi-led airstrikes have devastated Yemen's health, water, and sanitation systems, sparking a massive cholera outbreak. It's believed 1 million people have cholera in Yemen and pushing millions of Yemenis to the brink of starvation. We'll have more on the latest attack and the crisis in Yemen after headlines. In Toronto, Canada, a man driving a white van barreled at high speed through busy downtown streets Monday, swerving onto sidewalks and seeming to aim at pedestrians, leaving 10 people dead and 15 others injured. Police say the driver, 25-year-old Alec Manassian, was apprehended without a shot fired after he told officers he was carrying a gun, then shouted, "Shoot me in the head." The officer would not shoot him. Manassian left behind a path of injury and destruction nearly a mile long. Canada's federal public safety minister said investigators were still searching for a motive but did not believe there was a national security motive behind the attack. In Tennessee, police have arrested the gunman believed to be responsible for Sunday morning's mass shooting at a Nashville area Waffle House, which left 4 people dead and 4 others wounded. 29-year-old Travis Ranking was apprehended early Monday afternoon, not far from his apartment complex. He was carrying a backpack containing a pistol and ammunition and was arraigned on 4 counts of murder. Last year, Ranking had his firearms license revoked by Illinois police at the FBI's request after a string of erratic behaviors, including trespassing at the White House. The guns were then turned over to his father, who allegedly returned them to his son, including the AR-15 semi-automatic assault rifle used in Sunday's attack. On Capitol Hill, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee voted unexpectedly Monday to recommend Mike Pompeo to be confirmed as Secretary of State. The surprise outcome came as Kentucky Republican committee member Rand Paul unexpectedly voted in favor of Pompeo after repeatedly criticizing him over support for torture and for the invasion of Iraq. Pompeo's nomination had been widely expected to advance to the full Senate without a favorable recommendation from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which would have been been the first time in a century that had happened. But his bid was aided after at least 3 Democrats, Senators Joe Manchin, Heidi Heitkamp, and Joe Donnelly, said they'll vote to confirm Pompeo from the floor. Pompeo also has a long history of ties to Islamophobic organizations, and the National Iranian American Council has warned Pompeo's confirmation would threaten the Iran nuclear deal and increase the risk of a U.S. attack on Iran. Meanwhile, more than 100 former top U.S. military officials have signed a letter to senators asking them to oppose President Trump's nomination of the Central Intelligence Agency's deputy director to replace Mike Pompeo as CIA chief. The letter reads in part, "We are deeply troubled by the prospect of someone who appears to have been intimately involved in torture being elevated to one of the most important positions of leadership in the intelligence community," unquote. According to the New York Times, Gina Haspel oversaw waterboarding of prisoner Abdulrahim al-Nashiri at a secret CIA black site in Thailand in 2002. She also later advocated for destroying videotapes of another prisoner's waterboarding. Members of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee are in talks to delay Wednesday's planned confirmation hearings for Dr. Ronnie Jackson to become Veterans Affairs Secretary amidst reports of unspecified allegations of improper conduct during parts of his career. Jackson's currently serving as President Trump's personal White House physician. He has no leadership experience heading a vast government bureaucracy like the VA, the second-largest agency in the U.S. government. President Donald Trump and First Lady Melania Trump welcomed French President Emmanuel Macron and French First Lady Brigitte Macron to a formal state visit Monday, kicking off 3 days of events with a trip to George Washington's former Virginia plantation home of Mount Vernon. Today, Macron is expected to press Trump in face-to-face talks to keep the U.S. in the Iran nuclear deal. Tomorrow, President Macron will address a joint session of Congress. The state visit comes after France's lower house of parliament advanced an immigration bill introduced by Macron that would toughen France's immigration and asylum laws. The bill would shorten deadlines for migrants to apply for asylum, while doubling the time that authorities can detain them to 90 days. It would also allow for a 1-year prison term and fines for migrants found to have illegally crossed into France. Children could also be jailed with their families. The bill also continues a policy under which French citizens face fines and prison sentences for helping undocumented migrants, so-called crimes of solidarity. This is French parliamentarian Mathieu Orphelin.
Moi, je trouve incroyable qu'en 2018, un citoyen qui va faire un acte de solidarité.
I think it's unbelievable that in 2018, a citizen who acts in solidarity with a migrant or asylum seeker to help them during a health emergency, for example, can be convicted of that today in France. I think it's completely anachronistic, and this crime of solidarity must be profoundly modified.
In Greece, a mob of far-right militants attacked a crowd of asylum seekers Sunday night who gathered for a peaceful demonstration on the island of Lesbos, throwing stones, bottles, and flares and sending at least a dozen migrants to the hospital. The violence erupted after some 200 migrants gathered for a sit-in protest to call for improvements to the squalid conditions in their refugee camps. They were attacked by members of the Mytilene Patriotic Movement, who chanted, "Burn them alive and throw them in the sea." After anti-fascist activists intervened, fighting broke out for several hours before riot police used tear gas to clear the crowds. At least 100 people were arrested. Lesbos has been the arrival point for thousands of migrants who've made the perilous voyage across the Mediterranean from North Africa seeking asylum. It's currently home to about 10,000 asylum seekers. The White House sought Monday to defend a presidential tweet that's being blasted by immigrant rights groups as openly racist. The April 18th tweet was one of many recent attacks by President Trump on sanctuary cities that seek to protect undocumented immigrants. It read, quote, "There is a revolution going on in California. So many sanctuary areas want out of this ridiculous crime-infested and breeding concept," unquote. The president tweeted. This is White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders being questioned Monday by reporters Jim Acosta and April Ryan.
When he used the word breeding, was he making a derogatory term about Latinos in California, that they breed a lot or that they're prone to breeding?
No, he's talking about the problem itself growing and getting bigger.
What does breeding mean to this president? Because when you think of breeding, you think of animals breeding. populating.
I'm not going to begin to think what you think. Certainly, I think that it can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but the president is talking about a growing problem, and I addressed that with Jim. I don't have anything else to add.
In Tucson, Arizona, a federal jury has acquitted Border Patrol agent Lonnie Swartz on murder charges nearly 6 years after he shot and killed a 16-year-old Mexican teenager, Jose Antonio Rodriguez, who was unarmed and walking along a sidewalk on the Mexico side of the border in Nogales, Sonora, when Swartz fired on him through the border wall from the U.S. side. An autopsy shows Rodriguez was shot 10 times with 2 bullets in his head and 8 in his back. Swartz was cleared Monday of second-degree murder, while the jury deadlocked on 2 lesser manslaughter charges. Prosecutors said after the trial they're considering whether to bring a new manslaughter trial against Swartz. Following the verdict, scores of protesters marched from the courthouse and blocked busy intersections in downtown Tucson. In Armenia, thousands of people flooded the streets of cities around the country Monday after longtime leader Serge Sarkisian resigned in the face of a popular uprising calling for an end to his rule. The celebrations capped nearly 2 weeks of anti-government protests that Sarkisian's appointment to the newly powerful post of prime minister after he held power as president for the maximum of 2 5-year terms. He came under added pressure to resign after members of Armenia's military in uniform were seen joining recent protests. His resignation came as several opposition leaders were released after their arrests in recent days. And George H.W. Bush has been hospitalized and is in a Houston intensive care unit with sepsis after an infection spread into his bloodstream. A spokesperson for the 93-year-old former president said Bush is responding to treatments and appears to be recovering. Bush's hospitalization came one day after he attended a funeral for his wife, former First Lady Barbara Bush. Saturday's funeral was also attended by other former presidents and First Ladies, George W. and Laura Bush, Bill and Hillary Clinton, and Barack and Michelle Obama. First Lady Melania Trump also joined, but President Trump remained at his golf resort in Mar-a-Lago, where the White House says he watched the funeral on television. That weekend, he posted a tweet storm of something like 24 tweets. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Kim Jong-un and I declared together that there will be no more war on the Korean Peninsula, and a new age of peace has begun.
History was made on the Korean Peninsula today as the leaders of North and South Korea agreed to push forward, finally ending the Korean War, and to work toward ridding the peninsula of nuclear weapons. We'll get the latest. Then we go to Capitol Hill, where embattled EPA Chief Scott Pruitt came under fire Thursday.
I just think that every indication we have is that you really should resign, and you are undeserving of the public trust.
And as the Supreme Court looks poised to uphold President Trump's travel ban, we'll speak with Karen Korematsu, the daughter of Fred Korematsu, whose challenge of the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II went all the way to the Supreme Court. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. History was made on the Korean Peninsula today as South Korean President Moon Jae-in and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un shook hands at the demilitarized zone between the two countries and pledged to work to denuclearize the peninsula and to declare the official end to the Korean War. Today's historic summit marks the first time a North Korean leader has ever set foot inside South Korea. During the meeting, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un said, quote, "I came here to put an end to the history of confrontation," unquote. The North and South Korean leaders pledged to pursue talks with the United States aimed at negotiating a formal peace treaty to replace the uneasy 1953 armistice. This is North Korean leader Kim Jong-un speaking today.
We will make efforts to create good results by communicating closely in order to make sure our agreement signed today before the entire world will not end as just a beginning like previous agreements before today.
His breakthrough comes amidst a series of diplomatic developments regarding North Korea and its nuclear program. Last month, Kim Jong-un traveled to Beijing by armored train to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping in Kim's first foreign trip since taking office in 2011. Kim is also slated to meet soon with President Trump in what would be the first ever meeting between a sitting U.S. president and a North Korean leader. Last week, North Korea announced it would stop testing nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles and would close a site where at least 6 prior nuclear tests were held. This is South Korean President Moon Jae-in speaking today.
It is very significant that North Korea took a measure of freezing nuclear first. It will be a valuable beginning for the complete denuclearization on the Korean peninsula. I clearly declare that the South and North will closely cooperate for the complete denuclearization.
This morning, after tweeting against James Comey, President Trump tweeted, quote, "Korean War to end. The United States and all of its great people should be very proud of what is now taking place in Korea," unquote. We'll have more on the historic news from the Korean Peninsula after headlines. Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Scott Pruitt was grilled by lawmakers Thursday on Capitol Hill about a slew of scandals over his spending habits and ties to industry lobbyists. Pruitt faces more than a half-dozen investigations. Among the scandals, he paid only $50 a night to live in a Capitol Hill condo owned by the wife of a prominent energy lobbyist whose firm represents a roster of fossil fuel companies. Pruitt had a $43,000 soundproof phone booth installed in his office, which a government watchdog agency says violates spending laws and is illegal. Pruitt had the EPA spend $3 million on his security detail, including 18 full-time agents. Pruitt routinely travels first or business class, reportedly because Pruitt was confronted by economy-class customers angry over his policies. On Thursday, lawmakers demanded Pruitt's resignation and pressed him on reports he's retaliated against employees who raised concerns about his spending habits. This is New Jersey Democratic Congressmember Frank Pallone.
It has been reported that at least 5 EPA employees were recently reassigned, demoted, or otherwise retaliated against after they raised concerns about your spending. Is that correct, yes or no?
I don't ever recall a conversation
to
that end.
I'll take that as a yes.
We'll have more on Scott Pruitt's hearing later in the broadcast. The Senate has confirmed Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State in a 57-42 vote Thursday. Pompeo then rushed to the Supreme Court for his swearing-in, then to Joint Base Andrews, where he departed to Brussels for his first official trip as Secretary of State. Next, he's slated to visit Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. The White House has also released a photo of Pompeo shaking hands with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un during their secret meeting over Easter weekend while he was still director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Meanwhile, German Chancellor Angela Merkel is slated to meet with President Trump at the White House today. Secretary of State Pompeo will not be there. The National Security Archive at George Washington University has published declassified documents about President Trump's nominee to replace Pompeo as CIA director, Gina Haspel, who is currently serving as the deputy director of the CIA. The documents provide additional evidence as to how Haspel personally supervised the torture, including waterboarding of CIA prisoner Abdulrahim al-Nashiri in 2002 at a CIA black site in Thailand, and drafted cables ordering the destruction of videotape evidence of another prisoner's waterboarding. A jury in Pennsylvania has found comedian Bill Cosby guilty of 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault for drugging and sexually assaulting Andrea Constant, the former director of operations for the women's basketball team at Temple University, at Cosby's home in 2004. Constant is one of about 60 women who've accused Cosby of sexual assault dating back decades. Cosby called the Montgomery County District Attorney an a-hole, but used the first word publicly in court after the prosecutor argued Cosby should be jailed ahead of sentencing. Instead, Cosby was allowed to return to his home in Montgomery County, where he may be forced to wear an ankle bracelet if he leaves his house. The 80-year-old comedian is facing up to 30 years in prison. He'll be sentenced later this summer. Former NBC correspondent Linda Vester has accused longtime NBC anchor Tom Brokaw of groping her and trying to forcibly kiss her back in the early 90s. She says that once at the Denver bureau office, Brokaw came up behind her, put his hand on her waist, then groped her. A second time, she says Brokaw insisted on visiting her in her hotel room and then tried repeatedly to forcibly kiss her. Brokaw has denied the accusations. In Spain, thousands of people poured into the streets in cities across Spain in protest after 5 men accused of gang-raping a teen girl back in 2015 were found not guilty of rape and were convicted of only the lower charge of sexual abuse. The 5 men, who called themselves Wolfpack, lured the teenage girl into a building and repeatedly raped her while filming the assault on their cell phones. The men's lawyers claim the video footage showing the woman immobile with her eyes squeezed shut was evidence of consent. This is social worker Adriano Mamparlo speaking at a protest in Madrid.
To be honest, I feel shame we are still in a country like this one. In the 21st century, they are saying this is just abuse. Just an abuse, but she had to defend herself. I feel shame.
And in more news about violence against women, the Danish inventor Peter Madsen has been sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Swedish journalist Kim Wall. He's admitted to dismembering her body and dumping her into the sea. She's a graduate of the Columbia Journalism School. In Arizona, 50,000 teachers walked out of their classrooms Thursday, shutting down hundreds of high schools in the latest massive teacher strike to protest cuts to education funding. This is educator Mary Kotnur.
Well, the bottom line is funding for education. So a lot of people think it's just for teachers' salaries, and it's not. It's funding for the schools, for our kids. We haven't had the funding stopped in 2008 and has not increased. It's for our support staff as well. So it's for everybody. It's not what some people think, just for teachers.
Thousands of teachers in Colorado also walked off the job and converged at the state capital of Denver, forcing 27 districts in Colorado to cancel classes. President Trump gave a rambling 30-minute phone interview with Fox and Friends Thursday morning, in which he railed against the scandals that forced his personal physician, Dr. Ronnie Jackson, to withdraw from consideration as Veterans Affairs Secretary, boasted about firing former FBI Director James Comey, claimed he'd accomplished more than any other U.S. president in history during his first year in office, and admitted that his longtime personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, had represented him in the $130,000 non-disclosure deal with the adult film star Stephanie Clifford, known as Stormy Daniels.
Michael would represent me and represent me on some things. He represents me, like with this crazy Stormy Daniels deal. He represented me.
President Trump had previously claimed he knew nothing about the $130,000 non-disclosure agreement Cohen paid to Clifford only days before the 2016 election to keep her quiet about her alleged affair with Trump in 2006. In New York City, 14 members of the group Jewish Voice for Peace were arrested at a protest in front of New York Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer's office, demanding he call for an independent investigation into the Israeli military's killings of Palestinian protesters in Gaza over the last few weeks. Israeli forces have killed at least 36 Palestinians, including 2 journalists, since the weekly Friday protests erupted on March 30th. In Wisconsin, tens of thousands of people have been forced to evacuate after an explosion at a Husky Energy refinery in Superior. At least 10 people were injured in the blast. 1 is in serious condition. The cause of the explosion is unknown. And in Alabama, the editorial board of the Montgomery Advertiser published a public apology for its previous coverage of lynching. The same day, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice opened in downtown Montgomery Thursday as a monument to victims of white supremacy in the United States. In the editorial, the board wrote, quote, "We take responsibility for our proliferation of a false narrative regarding the treatment of African Americans in those disgraceful days. We propagated a worldview rooted in racism and the sickening myth of racial superiority. We must never be as wrong as this again," unquote. The Montgomery Advertiser was among many white-owned newspapers across the United States that failed to investigate and at times even celebrated the white mob violence that killed thousands of African Americans throughout U.S. history. Instead, it was black journalists, most notably Ida B. Wells, who exposed the horrors of lynching to the world. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
Nosso programa fica por aqui. Você pode acompanhar a gente pela página do Facebook e pelo blog do GECI Terra em Transe. Nos vemos na próxima semana. Até lá!